Hi guys. I just wanted to make sure that we covered everything before you take an open note quiz. Those of you who looked stuff up online yesterday, hopefully, I'm sorry if that caused you extra work. Hopefully that just means you're going to learn it better. Um, but you also alerted me to the fact that maybe, I know that I talked about it, but I guess I can't guarantee that I went over it very well, and I most certainly don't want to send you into a quiz unequipped. Um, so let's open up to that very last page in your notes where it talks about the competitive exclusion principle. Um, this is an example of that experiment that virtual lab that we did with the paramecium. In fact, we get this whole idea, competitive exclusion principle, from that very experiment. Let me get this opened up. Okay. So the competitive exclusion principle means competitive comes from competition. So two organisms, two species are competing for something until one excludes the other, or exclusively one is left. If I can spell exclusive, I can hardly reach up this high. So exclusively one. So competition between two organisms or two species until one is dies out. And this happens when an organism's niche completely overlaps. Now, if you've got two organisms may have a little bit of an overlapping niche. Let's say, and what I mean by overlapping is they need the same resources in the same area, in that same habitat. And so what ends up happening when you have that little bit of overlap, like let's say two insects, maybe they don't really inhabit the exact same area, and maybe they don't get their water from the same source, but let's say they share the same food source. What's going to happen is that's called an overlap, and where they overlap is where they're going to compete. So where there's overlap in niches, you're going to have a competition of some sort. But the competitive exclusion principle takes it one step further. If there's two species occupying exactly the same niche in exactly the same habitat at exactly the same time, then what's going to happen is when they're alone, they do well, no problems. But when they're grown together with completely overlapping niches, one is going to outcompete the other until one dies off. And that's characteristic of the competitive exclusion principle. So the question that I had asked is, how can you tell this is an example of the competitive or of the exclusion principle? Well, it should say the competitive. And it's because the two species thrived separately, but when grown together, only one survived. And then in this case, if you were to read this graph, which one was more competitive? And if you could see underneath my red marker, there was a blue line here for the Aurelia. And the blue is what took off up here. So the Aurelia was more competitive. Now we're talking a lot about competition. What really happens most of the time in nature, though, is organisms will learn how to divide resources. If they can divide the resources without competition, then everybody wins, right? So that tends to happen more so than competition. So one example of this, and this is a classic example, like if you Googled Warblers Niche, you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff out there, because there was this really famous study by a man who I don't even know the name of, but I would think that it must be the worst thing to ever study in the world, because he sat and watched these different birds go out every day, and he'd just sit and watch this tree and watch where the birds landed and keep track of who went where and what branches they were on and what branches they ate from and whatnot, and came up with this example of these North American warblers. That's the name of these birds. That's different species of this warbler. They all live in the same trees, but they occupy different parts of the tree, and that's how they've learned to divide their resources. So like this Cape May warbler is way up on the top branches, right up here. That's where he's going to exist and live and be happy. And for example, this myrtle warbler prefers the bottom. Now, if nobody's living up here, you might find some of the myrtle warblers wandering up, I guess, to those parts. But for the most part, you're going to find them on the bottom branches. And is that bay-breasted, I think? The bay-breasted warbler occupies the middle of the tree. Anyway, that's an example of how they divided their resources. So their resources are similar, but different. Therefore, each species has its own niche. All right. Good luck on your test.